Hello and welcome to the Wildlife Moto channel. So today's video is going to be an overview of the front suspension and steering setup on my 1981 BMW R100CS. Now these forks have been given the full treatment. They were completely rebuilt. I've got new springs in here, all new seals. The sliders have been taken off. They were powder coated, and just a little finishing touch, I've got these rather tricked out laser etched BMW plates in place of the tired old plastic reflectors that came from the factory all those years ago. Now this won't be for everyone, but I think it is a pretty nice touch. Now when I rode this bike before the strip down, before I decided to take it all apart, I did notice some pretty horrible head shake happening at around 30 miles an hour. Now, this could have been caused by the bearing preload being too loose. It probably wasn't also helped by the fact that both the front and rear wheels on this bike were found to be quite badly buckled. Now, these old Airheads, they are famous, or should I say infamous, for having pretty soft alloy wheels, and it doesn't take much more than a bit of a slam down a pothole or something like that to put a bit of a nasty dent in them. So I decided to go ahead and get these changed out. I got a second-hand set of wheels that thankfully weren't buckled, had those stripped, powder coated, got new seals in there, and they're now rocking a set of Conti Classic Attack tyres, which will sit alongside a whole freshly revamped braking system. We've got EBC ProLite discs. The calipers on this bike, you might have seen the video, they've been completely rebuilt. Also the surfaces inside those calipers have been remachined as well, and they've been Cerakoted. And I've also got a brand new set of Goodrich braided brake lines to go on the bike too. So hopefully, in terms of handling, it should be as good as it's ever been, put it that way, if not better. Now, when I started stripping the steering and front suspension, probably about a year ago, it was all a bit of a mess. As you can see from some of this archive footage, some videos and photos here show the bars were in a terrible state. Somebody had decided it would be a good idea to paint them while they were still on the bike, straight over the top of the rusty chrome. Delicious. So they had to go off to RS Chrome to get properly stripped and replated, and they've come back looking absolutely incredible. It was the same story with the bar clamps as well. We had lashings of black paint all over there, so I stripped those off with a bit of paint stripper and actually decided just to polish up the aluminium blocks, and I think again they look absolutely wonderful like this. All of the controls, previous videos show these have been stripped and Cerakoted, and I've replaced all of the working parts in the brake master cylinder up on the bars as well. And then the instrument cluster, which will eventually go back up here, that was looking pretty tired when I stripped it off the bike, potentially pretty leaky as well. The seals were all completely shot, and there's a separate video on that, but I stripped it, rebuilt it, put new lenses in it, and I've tested it for waterproofness, if that's a word, and they are. So looking forward to getting those installed as well. Now, all of the parts like the instrument brackets, the fairing brackets and the indicator brackets, they've all been stripped and powder coated. And I've also replaced the stock BMW top yoke with this unit from Toaster Tan, which is really the star of the show when it comes to the kind of modifications that I've done to the steering on this bike. The idea of this top yoke is that it's a little bit thicker, a little bit chunkier than the 4mm piece of steel that BMW gave us back in the day. So rumour has it this does great things for the handling of the bike. So fingers crossed it lives up to its reputation. Now, to install this, I did have to modify the headlight ears a little bit. Now this is because this Toaster Tan brace sits slightly lower on the stanchions, about 18mm lower, and that's really the whole point of this brace. It's all about gripping the top of those forks more than the 4mm stock plate. So we need to trim these ears down by around 18mm to make up the difference. It's a pretty simple job if you've got a Dremel or a hacksaw, but you do need to be really precise with this in order to get a good clamp on the headlight brackets when you go ahead and install the top brace. So you've got to measure that really well. Make sure you get almost exactly 18 millimeters in a perfect circle around the top of your headlights ears, and then go ahead and chop them off. Now, the problem that I ran into is because of the shape of these headlight brackets, you can see they're a bit of a taper shape. So simply cutting 18 millimeters from the top means that we've now got a wider radius on the top of this bracket. Now, consequently, it's too big for the rubber washer that goes on top. It literally just kind of falls inside. So I solved this by taking the cutoff that I got when I cut the 18 millimeters off the top of the ears, splitting it down the middle, and then shoving it back inside the top of each ear. And I used a bit of steel epoxy to bond it in place. And it turns out that this provides the perfect perch for that rubber washer to sit on. So it doesn't simply just drop down inside the bracket. It's now got a great surface in which it is able to kind of grip onto the top of the headlight ears. So a little solve there, which got me out of a bit of a problem. Now, the other way around this issue is not to remove all of the 18 millimeters from the top of the ears. You could, of course, cut some away from the bottom of the brackets as well. However, that's not a particularly good idea if you've got one of the S bikes like I have, because it's going to mess up your headlight alignment with the front fairing. So if you drop it down too low, your headlight might be too low to go into the round hole on the fairing without making some other adjustments. So I took it all from the top, and that was the little hack that I had to implement in order to get around that issue with the rubber washer. So with the headlight cut to the correct length, installing the front forks is actually pretty simple. Each leg needs to be measured so that we've got about 160 millimeters protruding up through the lower triple. Now, getting the stanchions through the lower yoke did require a little bit of persuasion by means of a large flat blade screwdriver. Just hammered it in with a rubber mallet just to open up the diameter slightly. And once that's done, you can just go ahead and slide the stanchions up nice and smoothly through the lower yoke. I then stacked on the headlight assembly, starting with the indicator bracket. These have also been powder coated black. Then we've got the new lower rubber, on top of which we seat our modified headlight ear. And at this stage, I'm also having to kind of thread through all of the loom for the indicator lights. That's definitely something you don't want to forget, because you're going to be very sorry if you get to the end of this job and realize that you forgot the blinker loom. So finally, I pressed on that top rubber washer, which now sits on the top of the bracket. And that's ready to be compressed into place when I go ahead and put on the toaster tan top plate. So before fitting the top plate, I did take the time to adjust the preload on the bearings. Now, these have already been greased and seated, so it's just a case of installing the chrome dust cap. And with the castle nuts taper facing down, that's quite important that it's the right way up. So that's the flat face facing up and the little taper on it facing towards the bearing. Just put a little bit of pressure through the threads until you get a nice smooth action through the steering. You'll kind of instinctively know when it feels right. It won't be too tight. You'll be able to move the forks nice and easy with a minimal amount of effort. Definitely you don't want it crashing from side to side, and you definitely don't want it so tight that, you know, it feels stiff and horrible. So you just have to play with that until you find that sweet spot. Now, I've already fitted the instrument bracket and the bar clamps onto the top plate. So all you got to do to fit it, obviously, is just drop it down over the stanchions and the stem and just make sure that it is all seated correctly. Then what I did is I just tightened down the main steering nut just enough to get it pressed down onto the stanchions. And as this nut gets tightened, you should notice that the whole unit is just kind of pressing down on top of those rubber washers on the headlight brackets. So it's going to be at this point that you realize that you've cut them too short, if you have, because they're going to still be flapping around. But if they're nice and tight in there as you start applying torque through that steering stem nut, then you'll know you're in a good place. And thankfully, mine turned out rather well, nice and tight in there. So with a little bit of preload down on the top nuts, we then grab these two rings, or these two spacers that make up part of the toaster tan kit. And these are going to get dropped into each hole and just sit on top of the stanchions. Now, if you've measured the stanchion height perfectly, we should get a protrusion on this ring of about 0.7 millimeters. So we're just going to sit very, very slightly proud of the surface of the top yoke. And the idea here is they're acting like a little bit of a spacer between the fork nuts and the top plates. So as you tighten the fork nuts down, it's not going to compress directly onto the top of the yoke. It's going to just push down on that ring and won't kind of mar up the surface of the yoke. Now, it's likely that you'll have to finesse the height of your stanchions a little bit to get to this precise measurement. And because I've got the S fairing on my bike, I've actually got another bracket which is going to go on top of these spacers. And that's going to be secured by the fork nuts when they go on. And then we've got 2 bolts that I've polished up and inserted through the toaster tan yoke, and they're going to hold those in position. Now, I've actually gone ahead and ordered a couple of really beautiful CNC machined top nuts for these forks. I'm not a huge fan of the plastic fork caps that you get from BMW on the factory setups. And also the nuts that I took off this bike are just absolutely awful. They literally look like somebody tried to undo them with a pipe wrench. All the corners are rounded off. You've got to get a tool like this, something like this tool from Flat Racer, as it is perfectly made to go over these flat nuts without completely damaging them, and it does a fantastic job. But if you try and do it with a normal socket, they will end up looking like this, because normally those sockets have got a little bit of a bevel inside them and they just skim over flat nuts like this. They're really, really not great for that purpose. Now, the other issue that I've got with the factory fork nuts is because they're so badly damaged, because they've been mullered up over time, the corners of the nuts have kind of folded over to the point that tightening these down onto my fairing brackets is just going to score the hell out of the powder coat. It's literally got teeth on the bottom of these nuts now. They're that kind of bent up. So I'm going to chuck those in the bin and replace them with these brand new caps. So to finish up the installation of the top plate, we need to put about 110 Newton meters of torque through this main nut, which is a fair amount. And to do this properly without damaging anything, you really don't want to be putting that much force through the forks and down onto the stopper on the frame. That could twist things up and cause all kinds of problems, which you don't want. So you need to find some way of relieving that torque so that it's not going through the bike. And what I did was I got an old set of handlebars that I found in the garage, just shoved them through the handlebar mounts on the top yoke, and then just used that as a torque relief. So I kind of pushed back on that as I was applying torque, so that the torque was going through those handlebars and basically resting on my back, rather than the whole fork assembly resting straight down on that stopper on the frame and potentially twisting up. It's quite easy to do, but it just gives it something to push against rather than twisting things up as it pushes against the stoppers on the bike. So 110 Newton meters of torque through that. And then the final part of the job is to go ahead and tighten up the pinch bolts on the lower triple and the TT plate. And this will get a final pass once I've filled the forks with oil and installed those new fork caps. But you definitely want to make sure that you have 100% done up your pinch bolts properly before you go ahead and take the bike off a jack, if that's what you're doing, because, well, that could be a real comedy show if you forget that. So, make sure you do that. And if you're going to leave it, I just tend to put a little bit of tape or something like that on my cap heads just to remind myself that they have not been torqued up. We'll get to that when we get all the parts through the post. Now, before wrapping up, it's a good idea to check that you can easily insert your wheel axle and nothing's binding up in there. You should also make sure that the sliders on the stanchions can smoothly ride up the tubes and kind of fall down under their own weight. Finally, the other thing to do once everything is torqued up is just double check that you've still got a good amount of friction through the preload on those steering bearings. Make sure that nothing is sounding gritty or kind of binding up, that you haven't accidentally gone and put a ton of force through that castellated nut and down onto your steering bearings. So make sure that everything is still nice and good with your steering, and then of course make sure there's no free play as well in your forks. So basically just grab them and give them a good shaking and make sure everything feels as it should. But as I said, we'll go through everything and do a bit of a belt and braces check once all of the other parts have been installed. I do rather suspect that once everything is installed on the forks, things like, the wheels, the brakes, the handlebars, the headlights, all that extra weight we're going to get on there, I may well need to go in and just make some changes to that preload on the steering bearings so that we get the steering exactly where I want it. So there you go. That's where I'm up to at the moment. I've just been going around the bike, also ticking off some other smaller jobs, dealing with things like stripped out threads on the frame. Always fun stuff to deal with. I'm also delighted to report that since filling up my freshly rebuilt transmission, there are no leaks, not even through the dreaded neutral switch. So everything seems to be oil tight, which means I'm now happy to go ahead and fit the swing arm, and then we can do the final drive. Then it would be the subframe and the rear shocks. And my God, we might actually be making some great progress on this build, finally. At this rate, it may well even end up under my Christmas tree with a big bow on it, addressed to me. But there's no rush. I'll take it as it comes, take as long as we need to get it right. And trust me, there are still plenty of opportunities to muck things up and cause delays, but for now, things seem to be going all right. Anyway, that's it for now. Until the next one, ride safe.